Welcome back to TechNet Radio. We're here with Bill Baer and Microsoft Certified Master and SharePoint Ranger, Brian Porter, as they discuss security with SharePoint 2010. Listen in as they discuss its various implementations and supporting technologies that can help ensure that your data remains secure and protected. Bill, the mic is yours.
Hello, and welcome back to SharePoint 2010 for the IT Professional on TechNet Radio. Again, today I'm your host, Bill Baer, and joining me again is Brian Porter, SharePoint Master and SharePoint Ranger here at Microsoft. Today's topic we're going to discuss is security with SharePoint 2010. So Brian, security is a pretty complex topic. Whether we're discussing client applications, server applications, the list goes on and on. Really, what do you see as improvements, though, in SharePoint 2010 related to security?
Well, I think some of the biggest improvements in 2010 specifically relate back to some very specific pain that people encountered in 2007. And I'm talking here about managed service accounts and the managed account infrastructure in SharePoint 2010. So one of the cool things for managing and maintaining secure installation in SharePoint 2010 that we bring to the table now is we have this piece of functionality called managed service accounts, and it does a lot of really neat things. One of the most interesting things that it does is it takes over, or can take over, password change management. So in 2007, people who wanted to change their service account passwords on a regular basis, perhaps they were forced to because of overarching IT policy, it was a very painful process. There was a lot of manual steps that you had to get involved in. And if you didn't take those steps before the account was locked out because of the password policy, or before someone else changed the password, for instance, then that service would just break. That service account could no longer authenticate. He'd be trying to use a password that was no longer valid. Well, with 2010, we'll actually, it's optionally, you can actually configure your managed accounts to manage this process for you. What we'll do is we'll actually detect the password change policies, and we will configure it on a schedule. We will reset the password some number of days before the password policy says that password has to be changed. Additionally, for those, everybody's been in this situation where something happens and you need to change quickly all the passwords for all the service accounts across the entire environment, and you need to do it right now. Maybe someone walked off with a password list, or something else happened that you feel that the security of your accounts, that you don't really have security over the control over the account passwords anymore. Now in 2010, it's a very simple operation, a little bit of scripting, a little bit of PowerShell, and you can really quickly knock out something to reset all your service account passwords all at once. Some of the really interesting thing about this automatic password change is that in 2007, you had to always know what the password of your service accounts were. You needed to know it. In 2010, you don't need to know it. SharePoint will generate a cryptographically strong random string to use as the password when you have automatic password change enabled.
Yeah, so it sounds like we're not storing passwords under our keyboards anymore.
Yes, so people don't have to store passwords under the keyboard, and of course that always increases the security, because it's the first place everybody checks, right? Additionally, we've got a couple other investments, multiple authentication types within the same zone. This was something that you couldn't do in 2007 that you can do in 2010. So in 2007, I can configure an alternate access mapping zone for one authentication type, but it couldn't do two. So I couldn't do Windows auth and forms-based auth at the same URL easily, not without doing some fairly involved tricks using AAM and split DNS. In 2010, we support multiple authentication zones when you're using claims-based authentication. And that's pretty neat, because that allows you to say, really simply, for some very simple scenarios, allows you to open up the door and let FBA users, forms-based authentication users, and Windows Auth users use the same URL. It's just an ease of use type thing. And of course, my favorite topic, especially for the smaller shops that maybe don't have dedicated IT security departments, is the early availability of the Security Configuration Wizard Manifest for SharePoint 2010. If you're at all familiar with the Security Configuration Wizard in Windows Server 2008, it reads these manifests and will then apply policy specific to a product or a set of products in order to ensure that the platform is in sort of a default secure configuration. We had one that was released for 2007, but it came sometime after the product shipped. With 2010, it's already available, and we're only a couple of months out from being shipped. And I think that it actually shipped. I think our configuration manifest, I think it actually shipped a month or two ago. So that's a great help for the smaller shops that they just need to make sure they get into a secure place. And then, of course, the last thing I guess I would say from security when it comes to improvements is just the advent of claims off. The fact that we now use claims internally when we normalize user accounts from inbound requests, we normalize to a claims-based representation. This solves a lot of the different problems that we had with weird things breaking when ACL sizes got really large for search, for instance. This solves a lot of those problems, but we still get the best of both worlds. So we're integrated with, from a technology stack perspective on the back end, we're integrated with Windows Identity Foundation, and that allows us to make use of some of the WIF investments and things like the Claims to Windows token service, so that even though we're all in with claims, we're using claims everywhere inside the product, you can still realize those advanced identity delegation scenarios back to non-claims aware applications. So just because we're doing a lot of stuff with claims now doesn't mean, and just because SQL Server, for instance, isn't a claims-aware app, doesn't mean that you can't still realize those scenarios where I delegate the user's identity all the way back through an Excel workbook running in Excel services that hits an SSAS cube, and we're doing that with cell-level security back in the SSAS cube, and I delegate that user's identity. I can still do that using things like the Claims to Windows token service.
So that's pretty cool. Sounds like there's a lot of things that we can do and a lot of flexibility. But one of the other things that I get asked a lot about is data loss prevention. And because it's important to a number of organizations, so these organizations may have specialized security constraints or some sort of process which requires them to have in place some kind of plan related to DLP. Do we have any options with SharePoint?
Well, we've always had ADRMS, or Information Rights Management. That's always been something that's always integrated fairly deeply with SharePoint. We've also, working with some of our third-party partners out in the field, we've also been able to integrate ADRMS, the product, into other vendors' products. MSIT, for instance, not too long ago, I believe, published a white paper where they talked about how Microsoft internally leverages a data loss prevention product from RSA that supports ADRMS for the dynamic discovery of classified information within the enterprise and then the application of RMS policies to those. For those people that aren't familiar, ADRMS used to be called Information Rights Management, is a security technology that simply it surrounds protected content in an encrypted envelope, and then that encrypted envelope requires the acquisition of a key from a central server, and that exchange to obtain that key to decrypt that document. That's a secure conversation that the user has to provide some identity, and then based on the template that's provided, allows us to do things like restrict what users can print from the document, if they can forward it, if they can save it to their hard drive, different policies that can be defined. So MSIT actually published a white paper where it talked about how their implementation of RSA DLP's product in concert with ADRMS allowed them to secure and prevent those types of data leakages. Of course, we've got a number of products ourselves. For instance, we've got Forefront TMG, Threat Management Gateway. TMG is great at inspection of outbound and inbound web traffic, especially for preventing web traffic to certain URL types to prevent things like phishing attacks, which can always result in potential data exposures. Large enterprises always need to be concerned about that type of thing. And, of course, one of the coolest things that TMG does from a security perspective, and this isn't specifically related to data loss prevention, but one of the coolest things that TMG supports is it's got great support for the publication of SharePoint sites and extranet scenarios, and can do some really interesting things for things like smart card or certificate-based authentication and authentication against Radius and LDAP sources.
So that all sounds pretty cool. One of the other things that tends to come up a lot is encryption of data at rest. So that can be an important requirement, especially in federal or government scenarios, and a lot of times in pharmaceutical scenarios, they want to know that even at rest, their data is secure. Do we have any options around SharePoint that can help us there?
Sure. Well, there's nothing in SharePoint that really helps with this other than the fact that our back-end database is SQL Server. So SQL Server itself has had some great investments in encryption and security over the last couple of years. And one of the key pieces of technology that can really help in this scenario from a solution perspective is something called transparent data encryption. So transparent data encryption works at the data page level inside the database itself. And essentially, it's exactly what its name implies. It's transparent to the calling application. So the calling application doesn't know anything is going on in regards to encryption of the data that it's passing to it. But internally, when you turn TDE on for a database, each individual data page that's housed in memory in SQL Server will be encrypted when it's written to the transaction log or when it's written to the actual data file that backs that database. The interesting thing here is that because we encrypt both the log and the data that's written out to disk, well, one, you get that encryption at rest security for your data, but the backups themselves are also encrypted. So even if you take tape backups of your SQL Server and you ship them off to an offsite location, you can be assured that no one will be able to access your data inside those tape backups at that offsite location. Now, all this encryption does come at a cost. So it's important to think about encrypted data is generally difficult to compress data, and that can impact things like backup compression. So backups might take a little bit longer if you're using encryption. Encryption is also a very expensive operation, right? So there's always performance implications. When I'm designing systems and I'm trying to look at encryption at rest, I always encourage my customers to define the workload very specifically for their encryption at rest requirements, because ultimately it costs a little bit more in terms of resources, hardware resources that you have to throw around in order to meet the same performance requirements. But TDE, especially when combined with other technologies, can provide a really holistic, great encryption story. So TDE allows us to encrypt the data at rest, but we can also encrypt the data over the wire with IPsec or SSL inter-farm and between the farm to the browser. So with a little bit of creativity, for instance, in your solution design, you can actually get to a point where the data is encrypted from delivery from the MOS environment or the SharePoint environment to the end user's web browser, all the way back to the database, all the way down to the disk. And of course, there's lots of people, any talk about data encryption for data at rest wouldn't really be complete without making mention of BitLocker for the server in the shared data space. A lot of organizations are looking at BitLocker and are deploying BitLocker successfully to do whole disk encryption, irregardless of an application's individual capability to encrypt data that it's laying down to disk. And this is great for shared data center scenarios where you have your hardware in a data center that you don't entirely own, and you maybe don't know who all has access to the disks in your SAN or to the disks in your direct attached storage or local storage on your servers. BitLocker is a fantastic way to protect those scenarios so that they have no opportunity to get you have a holistic protection then.
Pretty cool. So off the top of your head, what do you think are some of the most important things to consider when you're designing your SharePoint deployment? You're thinking about security and securing that deployment. What are some of the most important things or processes that you should run through as you're considering security for SharePoint?
Well, really, there's in my mind, there's four things that I try to drill home to my customers. One, security is not just a prevention topic. It's not just about keeping people from doing things or touching things or going places. Security is as much an availability topic as it is a prevention topic. And when it comes to SharePoint 2010, we've got some great improvements here. First-class support for database mirroring, for easy database reliability, the service application architecture, really supports, things like the distribution, federation of farm services across multiple services farms or single centralized services farms. And these services can be consumed across a WAN. Built-in health monitoring system for the identification of things like index fragmentation, other potential performance concerns across the environment. These are great elements that improve the availability of the farm. And to my mind, security and availability go hand in hand. You can't have a secure solution without also having an available solution. And organizations should also be wary of mistaking lots of firewalls for real securities. I see a lot of organizations kind of go firewall crazy. Firewalls with a ton of rules quickly become more of a router than a firewall. And just because I have a firewall with lots of ports open doesn't mean that I've actually improved the security of my solution. In fact, there's an argument to be made that you've actually decreased the security of your solution only because you've increased the complexity. And complexity is the enemy of security. A complex solution is more difficult to verify the security of. It's more difficult to maintain over the long run, and it's more difficult to recover in the event that you do have a breach or an attack of some kind. So where you can, keep things simple, and not throwing firewalls everywhere is one way to keep things simple. The other thing is to consider the end user experience. You know, most of us are working in IT, and it's easy to kind of get caught up in IT for IT's sake, but really IT is there to service its user base. And many security decisions taken without adequate consideration of what the ultimate user experience is going to be can really result in a slowing of user adoption and a slowing of, kind of solution uptake. It's important that organizations take the time to balance the risk of a given choice with its security implications and the user experience that would result. It's really critical to kind of fuse that to the decision-making process. And then the last thing that I would give as just something to consider is data isolation. Organizations generally are able to stratify their data security needs along some sort of business or functional unit boundary. And if you know, for instance, that you've got some financial data that's super important that you need to have all these controls on, kind of in supporting of my last point, do things to isolate that data within your environment. Set up a separate web application. And maybe that's the web app that has content databases that are secured with TDE, that has IPsec policies between SQL Server and the SharePoint farm, encrypting the data over the wire, that has an SSL certificate encrypting the data between the user's server and the browser, that's got the ADRMS policies, defined by policy on all the document libraries in that web application. And then I'll put my high critical, high security information, I'll put it in that web application. That does a couple things. One, it minimizes my hardware investment. The more security that you place on something, the more performance cost there always is. That minimizes the amount of investment I have to do from a hardware perspective. It puts everything in an area where I can isolate, I can manage that as an independent unit, and then I can have maybe more lax, more flexible rules for the majority of my content that I have less stringent requirements on. So I guess those are the four things that I generally try to have a conversation with my customers and make sure that they understand.
Cool. No, those are definitely good points, or at least points to consider as you're thinking about security and some of the risks that you may assume if you make some decisions that you feel provide the highest level of security, but at some point, it comes at the cost of manageability. So once again, this concludes our session of SharePoint 2010 for the IT professional on TechNet Radio. I want to thank you again, Brian, for joining us. And if you want to go ahead and let us know where we can find more information about you or some of the topics you post about, if you could share your blog or Twitter handle with us again, that'd be great.
Sure. If you want to read my ramblings, I post fairly frequently at brianporter.com. It's Brian with a Y. And my Twitter handler is @BetaPorter.
Great. So once again, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.